Hi guys, this is Jim with Performance Technologies again, back with the second part of our teardown of the 1990 300ZX twin turbo engine. If you're bored, like the first video in this series, with engine teardowns or longish videos that are tediously detailed, you might want to skip this one. Last time we tore the front of the engine off, cam gears, timing belt, cam covers, and intake manifold. This time we'll be removing the turbo, exhaust manifold, head, and other attaching pieces. Right now I'm removing the turbo intake from the passenger side turbo. It's just held on with 2 bolts. And as you can see, I've been wounded. I know better than to try to catch an engine that falls, but I tried it anyway and tweaked my left wrist. Putting the bolts back where they came from so I know where they are when I need them again. Now you can't get these heat shields off of the exhaust manifolds yet until the turbo comes off, but we can get them ready. The 4 nuts that hold this turbo on to the underside of the exhaust manifold have sheet metal bracket sort of things that keep the nuts in place. They have an ear, a squared ear that bends down against the flat part of the nut to keep the nut from backing off due to heat expansion and contraction when cooling, and vibration and that sort of thing. So you need to get your screwdriver wedged between that ear and the nut, just the tip of the screwdriver, and kind of bend it out, twist the screwdriver, get that sheet metal bent away, and then you can use the tip of the screwdriver and a hammer to drive it down flat. Otherwise, you can't get a wrench or a socket on there, and that's its job, is to keep that nut from coming off. The rear 2 are pretty easy with the engine out of the car because they're right in front of you. You can see them and get to everything just fine. The front 2 are a little more challenged, but they're not too bad. Okay, the outer front nuts is the same way. It's captured with that little sheet metal ear, and you can get to it above the center housing of the turbo. Get your tip in there and bend that tab out so you get some room. The rear one is a little more difficult. It has to be done from underneath. You'll need a long screwdriver to get up there to it. Well, I found a lost bolt that was stuck up in there. Okay, with those tabs out of the way, now you can go about getting your 12mm box end wrench and a socket with a long extension to get those nuts off of there. Always use, if you have to use a wrench or a socket, either one, always use a box end wrench. Don't use an open end on exhaust components. They're almost always rusted and they're very easy to round the heads off. So use a box end, a 6-point if possible. Same with sockets. Sockets aren't as bad about rounding things off, but they can do it easily, especially on exhaust components. As you can see, that innermost that hurt my wrist. That innermost front nut you can get to from underneath as well with a long extension. Just breaking loose the oil drain back tube off the bottom of the center section of that turbo. It runs down to a rubber hose that goes on a nipple there at the side of the oil pan. There's one of those on each side of this engine since it's twin turbo. Each turbo has its own drain line. That's the oil drain. The oil comes in through the top pressurized and goes out through the bottom drain line, which is a 1/2-inch ID line, and it gravity feeds back to the oil pan. Removing a water line. That's the rubber part of the water line that runs to that turbo. There are 2 water lines. One's a return and one's an intake. Now I'm breaking loose the oil line junction that's on the back of the engine. It's a banjo bolt fitting. Now I'm going to use a line wrench to pull the oil line out of the center section of the top of the turbo. Always use line wrenches. Again, don't use an open-end wrench. A regular open-end wrench will just round off bolt heads real easily. Use a line wrench. It's a 6-point wrench, box end, that has a cutout in the front that's just wide enough to fit over the line. It gives you a lot more control and torque over the thing, and it's not nearly as liable to round that head off of that oil fitting or air conditioner hose fittings or any other kind of line fittings. Once it's broken loose, then you can use a standard open-end wrench. I had no idea I moved my mouth around so much when I work. With the oil line out of the way, I can get back to pulling the turbo. Now we're going to go ahead and pull that oil drain tube completely off. Now I'm going to put all the nuts are off of that turbo right now. I'm going to put one of them that's easy to get to back on, just a couple, 3 threads to keep it from sliding off the stud. The only thing holding that turbo on right now is the oil drain line. And just twist that, and the rubber hose part will pull off the oil pan nipple. We take off our nut we just finger tightened on there and let it slide on down. I'm spraying PB Blaster on these exhaust nuts and studs. And I'll give it about 10 minutes and let it soak in, and then we'll break these things loose now that the heat shield's out of the way. Okay, all of them are off but 2. We'll get that bottom one off of there, and then there's one top one. These each have a cast iron washer, a very thick cast iron washer under each nut, and they are a Lockings type nut. And there's that washer. Be sure and inspect these manifolds. They hang a lot of weight off the end, and they are cast iron. They're pretty good quality cast iron, but they need to be inspected for cracks and warpage, things like that. There's a lot of weight hanging off of them. Turbos, even though they're not terribly big, are pretty heavy. And we're going to break down the motor mount support off the side of the engine. This is the support that motor mount, biscuit style motor mount, is mounted to. The other end that has the stud on it goes to the frame. Actually, the cross member. And that inner one's kind of a little bitch to get to, but it does come off finally. We're going to remove the oil filter adapter. It's just a 90-degree adapter that hangs the oil filter down instead of straight out to the side. Okay, with all that done, we're going to go ahead and pull the cams out of this thing, out of this passenger side head. Those camshaft caps, they're just like a main bearing cap, except smaller, and they are aluminum. They're held in there with 6mm bolts, 10mm head, and they're relatively long bolts, so they're not terribly tight. They will require some torque to break loose because they have a tendency of sort of welding themselves in over a period of time with heat and cold and dissimilar metals. but they're pretty easy to get out. Okay, this front cap is where the oil seal goes. It goes around the nose of that camshaft and drives into that cap. And it's rubber coated all the way around that outside, and it's steel reinforced. So it grabs that cap pretty good. So you'll have to kind of tap it back and forth from the front and the back with a dead blow hammer or a rubber mallet. And once it moves, it'll come off pretty easily. Just like that. Now that camshaft is the same way. To get it out, you're going to have to tap on it probably. For the same reason, that seal still has it captured into the head. And just lift the cam straight out. And sort of inspect parts as you go to see if there's any damage that's noticeable. Check those valve buckets. Those are a hard chrome bucket that sits down over the valve spring and the valve stem, and it's what the camshaft rides against that actually pushes the valves down. And be sure to put these caps back on the way they came off and in the order that they came off. As you take these things off, try to put them on a towel or something like that in the same order that they came off from front to rear, and get them back on in the same order. They're sized for each of those journals. It's a good idea to mark these things before you take them off. If you have a marking set, you can stamp them 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or you can use a punch and put 1 dot on the first, 2 dots on the second, etc. They're just aluminum, so they're not terribly hard to do. It doesn't take much force to get a mark on them. Just keep them in order. That way you know which head they came off of, which cam they came off of. Okay, the cams are out. Going to put some pieces back on just like we did on the other one. Get those cam bearing caps back on. Okay, now in theory, that head is ready to come off. Everything that was attached to it should be gone. We're going to go ahead and rip these head bolts out. These heads are held on, like most import engines, with Allen head bolts. They're I believe they're a 12 millimeter stud size, and they use a 10 millimeter Allen socket head. Most imports are going to that because they take up less room than a hex head type bolt. Just use a breaker bar, or if you've got a good 1/2 inch drive impact, it's fine to use air tools to tear these things down with. as long as you're careful doing it. As with all my videos, I'm trying to do this with tools that you likely have or can get easily and inexpensively. Okay, all the bolts are out. And now we want to check one last time to make sure everything is off that head that might be holding it to the block. And it looks good to me. You take a pry bar, find something to support it against, put it under the lip of the head, give it a little push. The only thing holding that head on is 2 locating dowels and the head gasket. The head gasket tends to glue itself down over time, and you just got to kind of rock it. And lift it sort of straight up, and it'll eventually come off. Like that. Doesn't look terrible. I'll go ahead and check these cylinder bores while I'm at it. As you can see, it does have some nice looking cross hatching in it. So I stand by my estimate that this engine probably has somewhere between 40 and 60,000 miles. Just checking for damage, for scratches, blue spots from overheating, any ring damage, anything that's just noticeable. And we're also going to check for the cylinder ridge to see how much wear there is in that cylinder. I can't feel a ridge. There's some carbon up at the top, but there's really no cylinder ridge that'll catch a fingernail or anything like that. A better look at the cylinders. There is a little bit of surface rust. It's just discoloration more than rust because the engine's been sitting. And it's been sitting outside. It's been covered, but it's still been outside. And kind of a nasty shot of the heads. I'm sorry, this is handheld and it's hard to hold the camera steady when it's zoomed in. If you get motion sickness, you might want to look away. Okay, that's that for this one. Reason I'm doing this is because I think it's just as important to see how to tear an engine down and what to look for, what kind of problems you might run into, as it is building an engine. As always, have fun, drive safe, and we'll see you guys later.